That last video was disrupted for some reason, but let's go ahead and continue on. I believe I was actually showing the render setup. Now, when we do the render setup, this is where we can actually use these commands to render our stuff by hitting F10 either on your keyboard or hitting the button up here. And the most important piece is the very bottom is the actual render button. So if I were to click that now, this render is actually going to be very quick, showing the actual render of the geometry in its state. And here we can have lighting, we can have everything right inside of this. We can render our animations, we can do everything. We can render it out as a QuickTime, an AVI, a GIF. We could do any countless amounts of things in here. We really don't go over much of the rendering because there's a lot to get into in here, and specifically it's targeted to other more advanced classes. But let's say I wanted to render something as HD TV video that can actually output in the correct file format and file size, 1920 by 1080, for an HD TV. I could then do that by just clicking on there and clicking render, and now it actually is going to fit in high definition quality right onto an HD TV. We can even render out as IMAX if we wanted to. 70mm IMAX. Hit render. Oh, that's awfully little. Let's do, watch how large this is for IMAX. It's 4096 by something. So if I render that, that's how high quality it is. So let's go ahead and close and stop this. Okay, so that's kind of how we have this set up, and the hotkey for that is F10. The next one over here is actually the hotkey is it's like pushing that render button I pushed on the render setup, and it's kind of doing the same thing right here. Or the hotkey for that is actually F9. So sometimes during class, I'll use the terminology. I'll say, hey, could you hit F9 and render that out for me? Boom, that's what it means. Or I'll just say hit F9. Now, for those of you who are doing it right now, as I speak, and you've never done this before, be proud of yourself. You just created your first rendered 3D image. So yay! There was a bunch of chuckles. I just want to say that in the microphone. Now, render production, you can actually choose different types. If you want to do test renders, this is where you can select something like just doing a test render, or you can actually do this one right here, which is like called active shade. Active shade is like a test, smaller resolution render where you can just do quick tests and render, because a lot of your renders are going to take a while, especially a lot of the visual effects and animation students. A lot of your stuff is going to take considerably much longer to render than a lot of the game art or VGP students, because you're going to use higher polygon count, larger texture maps, and things like that. A good example would be, let's say, a game engine renders characters, effects, and everything instantaneously through the graphics processing unit. For animation, such as films like either Pixar films or even modern Avatar, some of the rendered character shading renders that were on Avatar took up to 3 days just to render a single frame of animation. And that's with supercomputers. Rooms the size of this entire school filled with Xenon processors processing all that. And the example I really like to give is back with the Pixar movie A Bug's Life. There's a part where Hopper and his gang are actually walking through the fog. Now, back when Pixar, before they actually moved to their original building, that took 72 hours per frame just to render that animation. Even up to more recently, the Pixar film WALL-E, when WALL-E is actually riding on Eva's ship and he puts his hand through the particles that are actually up in space, just the render of those particles themselves took almost 72 hours just for the particles, not WALL-E, not lighting, not shadow or anything. And I've been to Pixar, my good friend works there. The Pixar render farm actually is about the size of this school, filled with about 2,000 giant server towers filled with Xenon processors, and even then it took that long to render. So please, especially visual effects and animation students, keep your renders realistic, because how many of you have walked into a computer lab and actually seen something on the keyboard that says, please do not touch rendering? That's the purpose. They did not listen to rules, they did not plan out their rendering, and that's what happens. Alright, since I just spent too much time talking, let's continue on. Next thing we're going to move into is the sidebar over here. The sidebar over here, which actually is called the dumb bar, not because you're dumb for using it, it's just because that's what it's traditionally always been called. And it has a bunch of different tabs up here. The first one being Create, the next one is Modify, Hierarchy, Motion, Display, and Utilities. Now each one of these has its own set of settings within it. And I'm just going to move my mouse cursor over and actually pull these over and show you the extent of how these can actually get. So if I actually, just with that model there, the model that's on screen, which is a fairly low poly model, these are all the controls that freak a lot of people out. But as the way this class is dictated, excuse me, I can tell you right now you're probably only going to use 2 or 3% of all these buttons in here in your entire time modeling, because a lot of it is redundant. A lot of it is hotkeys, stuff you'll pick up. These little buttons here, they can be represented and selected just by hitting 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on your keyboard. Okay? And there's selecting things like vertex, edge, border, polygon, element. And we'll get into what those are here in just a minute. If I have nothing selected, let me pull this all the way back over. With nothing selected in the scene, I've got this place here where I can make geometry such as boxes, spheres, cylinders, torus, teapots. All this stuff can be here, but I can also create extended primitives. I can create compound objects, which we'll go into in later lectures. Particle systems, like such as a super spray. I can actually put a super spray right here, hit play, and watch the particles emit from it. I can then maybe, let's say, load the fireworks and actually make particles that actually do this. I can do like welding sparks to where sparks would emit from a welding torch. I can make a hose to where then if this is rotated in different ways, I could animate it. I'm not really teaching animation at the moment, but I want to show you how it is possible. So let's say that actually goes like this and it's animated. It will then animate according to that and emit particles accordingly. The particle system is extremely solid in 3ds Max. The problem being is that it's very intensive, not only computer-wise but also learning-wise. There's not much of a learning curve when it comes to learning particles in 3ds Max. The same with Maya. We have patch grids, NURB surfaces, doors, windows, mental ray, ACE extended, which where we can actually create foliage. If I wanted to put a generic palm tree in here, boom, there's a palm tree. Okay, more for architectural design. Stairs, it's the way we cheat. Okay, we want to make stairs. There, stairs. We also have this thing called splines. We're going to move into splines around week 3, where we can actually create Bezier curves that actually create splines. We could create text right inside of here. Boom. We can change that text to J-O-H-N-N-I-E. See? And then we can actually make all this stuff where it's renderable. Then over here in the hierarchy tab, because I'm not going to move into any of these just yet, the hierarchy is where we can actually set pivot points for like animation, like the elbow bends correctly. We can do all that stuff. We can go over here to motion, where we can actually set up trajectories and paths to actually make things move through 3D space. Display here is where we can turn off different things like hide. If I want to hide all the cameras, I can just turn them off and you'll notice the camera disappeared. I can hide all the geometry. Okay, you can just do that. It's kind of like setting up layers, but in this case you actually have just a selection. And the utilities tab. This is really in depth. We tend to not really deal with it with principles class because you can actually do things like access Max scripting in here. You can open 3D Max Listener, which actually records everything you're doing in 3D space in a line of code that can then be understood. So as I do something, the actual code will pop up for Max scripts on here. And it enables you to actually create your own tool sets. It's something a lot of the VGP students will grow to love when they actually take Max scripting. But for the rest of us, we don't really get into it that much because it's more for the programmer, not the artist. So going back over to here, this is where we actually can go in and create things like lights, photometric lights, which are based on real-time, real-world things. We can actually then create standard lights, which is a lot of people use first off, especially students. And even myself, I use a lot of them, such as Omni lights, where we can actually render real-time lighting right inside 3ds Max. You can see the lighting passing around there. Spotlights, target lights, direct lights, skylights. We can do a whole bunch of cool stuff. And we really don't get into lighting too much in this class because it is very overwhelming. And it is something that, even with the basic knowledge, you're going to tend to light very, very badly. Okay? Because lighting really includes the use of color theory. You need to understand how how light works to actually lighten CG correctly. And if anybody does have aspirations to be a lighting artist, I suggest you start painting if you don't already. And I suggest you be good in math, because that's kind of what it has to do. Now, when I left Blizzard, I was actually the lead lighting artist for a game that was canceled called Star